Right. Welcome to the panel, Protecting Victims, Lessons Learned from Reporting on Human Trafficking. And with the climate crisis and wars, migration is one of the major issues of our time. So it's important to discuss this really important issue on such a global stage today. So we're going to hear from myself and 3 other journalists who've investigated human trafficking across Europe and also wider than that as well. So just a quick overview of what we're going to do. So each panelist will give a quick overview of their work in the area. But this is a practical session, so we're going to have very interactive discussion, lots of tips, and also lots of time at the end for Q&A. So make sure to keep those questions at the end, and we'll give you lots of time for them. So let's start with some introductions. So my name is Maria Delaney. I'm the editor of Noteworthy, which is an investigative platform in Ireland. We're a crowdsourced and crowdfunded platform. We also have Ismail Einashe, who's reported on victims of trafficking from Bangladeshis exploited in the food industry in Italy to migrants trafficked into the UK. And he's an Ockberg Fellow and Associate Trainer at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. We also have Sasa Lekovic at the end. He's co-author and editor of the recently updated Human Trafficking Manual for Journalists, and he's president of the Investigative Journalism Center. And his investigative stories put an international human trafficking boss behind bars and helped a trafficked girl who was forced to be a prostitute return home. And we also have Geesje van Haren, who will speak about investigating the most vulnerable of victims of human trafficking, as she is the driving force for Lost in Europe. And this cross-border project has shown that thousands of children go missing after registering in Europe, with many falling victims to criminal gangs. So very briefly, I'm just going to take the stage, which is not a great thing to do as a moderator, but I'll hand it over to the other panelists soon and be a proper moderator. So Noteworthy, as I said, is a crowdfunded and crowdsourced investigative platform. It's part of The Journal, which is Ireland's online only native site in Ireland. We're a national news outlet. So one of our focus is, because we're crowdsourced, so people propose ideas to us, is that we often focus on underreported communities. And I strongly believe that it's stories, not data, that haunt us at night, and it is people, not numbers, that move us to tears. But at Noteworthy, we back up these strong stories with evidence and data, and I think that's the most powerful way of covering social injustice. And here's just a sample of these stories. A number of them have won prestigious awards, and also we have managed to change policy, and a lot of them have been brought up in the National Parliament. So I'm just going to very quickly focus on our main work on human trafficking, and it was an investigation called Hands on Deck. And this was into the exploitation of migrant fishers in the Irish fishing industry, so migrant workers. Now, it followed, The Guardian had done an investigation into this a number of years ago, in 2015, and we followed it and looked at what happened after that. So there was a law brought in after that to kind of help prevent further trafficking and also to legalise fishers in the system. But we found it actually legalised trafficking, so people were being brought in and then exploited. So it was labour exploitation that we were looking at. So we did a cross-border investigation with a journalist in the Philippines, Gila Garcia, and we also teamed up with Louise Lawless, who looked at the legal side of things. So I suppose one tip from that is to examine your own laws and look for failings in the law that is allowing people to exploit other people. So we did a lot of on-the-ground reporting. Finding sources was very difficult, and also managed to get a lot of documents through freedom of information requests and also publicly available documents. So here's one of our freedom of information requests. So it was a submission by workers to a change. The government were looking for submissions for a change in the law, and it was a really great example of being able to show what workers were feeling and how they were being treated in their own words. So I'm just going to introduce you to Lloyd, who isn't his real name, but he's a Filipino worker. This is the route that he went through. So we tracked his route all the way from his hometown in the Philippines. So he flew from Manila to Abu Dhabi, then to London, to Belfast, and then to Castletownbere. And this is a well-known route for human trafficking to come through the UK into Ireland. And most of the fishers that we spoke to were from the Philippines, Ghana, Indonesia, and Egypt, and those are the kind of the prominent countries that people come from. So Lloyd said that after several years working back and forth as a seaman, it was the first time that he experienced any employer that abused him. He also claimed that he was physically abused by the skipper, and he said, "It hurt, I felt the punch land. I told him if he did it again, I'd report him." So those are the kind of examples of what was happening to people in Ireland. And our investigation found that there were 35 referrals of alleged victims between 2017 and November 2022, but no prosecutions in Ireland. So this was an issue that a lot of people highlighted to us. Claims of widespread trafficking and exploitation were contested by organisations representing vessel owners in Ireland. So we did a series of articles, so these were two of the articles that we published. We looked at the reforms that the government were proposing on the law that was quite controversial, that people were saying was allowing legalised trafficking. But these reforms excluded undocumented workers. So we kind of exposed also modern slavery in the Irish fishing industry. Now, there isn't, unlike the UK, there isn't actually any legal basis of modern slavery, so people have to go through the human trafficking legislation. So that's also an issue in Ireland. So Renee was one person, one Filipino that we spoke to, and we also spoke to his family back in the Philippines to see what the impact of his exploitation was. So Renee said, "I was sleeping in the boat the whole time, even though my contract said my employer should be providing me a flat. They didn't even give us an allowance for food. We had to eat leftover meat and fish on the boat." And then Renee's wife, Matilda, told us there was a time we couldn't buy food. We couldn't buy rice because there was really nothing coming from him. We had a hard time eating 3 times a day. And then his youngest son said, "I was so stressed because of what happened to my father, to the point my hair was falling out." So I suppose we gave a unique perspective of the whole family impact of human trafficking. We also obtained almost 100 inspection reports from different state bodies backing up stories. And one of the key things we did, which is the bottom article here, is that we examined recent workplace relations commissions, so the work court cases, and we showed for absolute definite that migrant fishers' rights were repeatedly breached by vessel owners. So then just finally, the investigation had a lot of impact. Obviously we couldn't, one of the things that people came to us, and we'll talk about this later, is with expectations of how are you going to help me, I need to get a visa and things like that. And obviously we couldn't promise anything beforehand. We were very clear and managed expectations, but it did actually have a lot of impact, the investigation. I was invited to speak in the Parliament for a parliamentary briefing after this, and that was with the International Trade Federation, or the ITF, and also the Migrant Rights Council of Ireland. The International Transport Workers Federation. And the Taoiseach, who is Ireland's equivalent of a Prime Minister, at the time, he actually recently resigned, very recently, but he said he's heard and read about some really appalling examples of abuse that aren't far off modern-day slavery. And as far as I know, that was one of the rare examples of the use of the term modern-day slavery in the Irish Parliament. And also fishers in the controversial scheme that I spoke about were offered the type of visa that they were campaigning for. And the US Department of State Trafficking in Persons report cited our findings. And there was a chapter in what Sasha is going to talk about, a reporting manual for trafficking. and the investigation also won a Humanitarian Journalism Award from the Irish Red Cross, so it did have a lot of impact. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand it over to Ismail now to speak about his work.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I guess the first slide, I'm just going to talk about 3 specific stories which concern trafficking and modern slavery. And the first one, thank you, Geesje, is from Sicily. It's from Campobello di Mazara, and it was part of an investigation we did that was funded by Journalism Fund Europe. And it was looking specifically at the experience of migrants in the agricultural sector in Italy and Spain, and also in the Netherlands. So what we're trying to do is look at the issue of olives. And this is, I think this is just a stock image, by the way. So these, if you read the story on the BBC, you'll see better images by Kate Stanworth, who I was working with, who took the images for the story. But for this story, we were very much looking at what happens to migrants that are trafficked, usually through, obviously, the central Mediterranean route, and then who end up working as laborers exploited in a system of gang masters. And according to the UN, somewhere between 450,000 to 500,000 migrants are working in the agricultural sector here in Italy. Some of you will probably know this. We're in Italy, we're in Perugia, but this is an issue across this country and in other places in Europe, but because obviously Italy is a big exporter of olives and tomatoes and so on. So for us doing this story, it was really interesting to connect what was happening on the ground here, but also what was happening in the markets that these products usually go to in London or in Amsterdam, because people buy this variety of Sicilian olives because they're considered to be they're very bourgeois, they're very lovely, they're plump, they're green, and actually there is exploitation and abuse in the supply chain. And we brought this different lens of looking at this, not just in terms of the exploitation, but in terms of the climate aspect, because migrant farm workers are very much on the front line of the climate crisis in Europe. If you look at the conditions in which people work in, outdoors, long hours, some paid as little as €2 an hour. Often they're working through middlemen who are essentially gang masters, which is a practice which is technically banned, illegal in Italy, but still continues. And we found evidence of that, and we found evidence of criminal gangs and others operating between the worker and the farmer, shipping them into this place. And where we went with this story was this place, Campobello, which did burn down sadly, but they call it a ghetto, and it's a place where hundreds of migrants, usually Senegalese, Tunisian, Gambians, the day laborers that are working out picking the olives and various other things like tomatoes and potatoes and so on, but this primarily olives. And it was really shocking. I've reported from lots of places in the world where there's more violence and there is distress and there's conflict. And it was pretty shocking to be in Italy, in Europe, and to see the exploitation and the abuse and the conditions in which people were living in. I mean, there's no running water, there's no electricity, there was rotting lamb bones and meat, because people usually, because they have to eat halal, quite a few of the residents are Muslim, so that means they have to rear the sheep on the ground, with this makeshift, basically camp, and everything's built from whatever they can find. And it was pretty distressing to see that, and to also see the exploitation that happens both between the farm and the worker, but also to situate this in a larger issue of the supply chain. So we did a number of stories that were published, and I think for me, one of the things that was really particularly distressing about this was the fact that quite a few of them were minors or teens, and there were also people that were often on drugs, and there were some signs of forced sexual activity that was going on. And the other aspect of all of this is that we also looked at it in the Netherlands and tried to ask, well, what do consumers know in the Netherlands? And Geesje worked with us on the story there. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is another investigation. I've just given one snippet. You can find these stories all online. Again, this was funded by Journalism Fund Europe, and it was a grant that they have called Modern Slavery Grant. And like Maria, we both got the same grant, and you were working on the connection between the Philippines and Europe, and we worked on the connection between Bangladesh and Europe. And we did 3 different investigations, and this was the first one from 2021, 2020, and what we did is we worked with our colleague Mohammed Al-Azim. He's a brilliant Bangladeshi journalist, and he works for Protum Alo, who are the most important newspaper in Bangladesh. And what we wanted to understand is the deception that traffickers use. In this case, in Bangladesh, they call them dalals, which mean travel agent, but they're not really travel agents. They're traffickers working in a transnational context that stretches from Bangladesh, usually via lots of countries in the Middle East, Dubai, Turkey, and so on. And then eventually people end up in Libya, and they end up in a situation which is horrendous. And these people are, not just even young people, they're children. Because often what happens in Bangladesh is that the traffickers forge their passports. So they make them out to be older than they actually are. And what we did is, if you just go to the next slide, please, final one, is that they basically create this whole deception story and tell them that Libya is a perfect place where they can work, can make money, and so on. And the reality was always very different. And what happens, and we've interviewed dozens and dozens of young people. This has happened to children, and we've done a lot of stories which you can find online, so I won't go into all the details. But what they do is basically, as soon as they land in Libya, in Tripoli, usually, or Benghazi, they take their passport away, and we heard so many horrendous stories, and we interviewed a lot of them, primarily in Sicily, of just violence, horrendous, awful violence that's happened to people, and people have been wronged. And that's what happens when you're working with victims of trafficking and modern slavery. You're talking about situations where people have not only had deception and violence, but they've also lost control of the situation. We'll come to that a bit later about how do we deal with that, and how do we have sort of trauma-aware techniques. And finally, this story we published in El Mundo with our colleague there, Rosa Menezes. And again, this was the final 3-part investigation we did over 3 years in Sicily and Libya and in Bangladesh. So the first one was about mapping the trafficking route from Bangladesh all the way to Europe. And the second one is we looked at, we kept seeing things in Palermo, which we spend a lot of time in, because we kept seeing all the young Bangladeshi guys that were on mopeds delivering Deliveroo or Glovo or whatever, and people eating sushi a lot, so we thought we'd go and eat some sushi in Palermo. And then I was quite surprised because they served basmati rice as the sushi rice, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And then I got a fortune cookie alongside the sushi, and I was like, well, that's not typical, is it? And then I found out that actually a lot of the restaurants in Palermo were usually owned by Chinese migrants, and the workers were actually Bangladeshi kids, and many of them don't like fish and wouldn't definitely eat raw fish. So it was that's what started this investigation, and then we discovered this whole web of exploitation that is going on. And the final point, the final investigation we did was about what happens to people on beaches, because that's another form of exploitation.
That are in the tip sheet, and we have a QR code, a big one at the end, where you can go to that. It's a PDF. So, Sasha.
Thanks. First of all, thank you everyone for coming here. Actually, I'm the old school. I'm in journalism for 45 years now, professionally. And I like to look you in the eyes when I'm speaking, and I want that from you, if it's possible. Okay. Actually, I used to be a local correspondent, then local journalist, then local correspondent in Croatia for some dailies and magazines, and after that I became a reporter and editor in some biggest dailies and weeklies in Croatia. But last 20 years, I'm actually a reporter, investigative reporter, investigative reporting trainer. I got a license. I'm licensed international trainer for investigative reporting, and I'm working also as a sort of let's say advisor, media advisor all around the world. I've been, for example, in Bangladesh in 2 biggest dailies in local language and in English, establishing investigative reporting teams. And I've been also in Africa working as a trainer, but now I'm also working as an assistant of editor-in-chief in Nacional in Croatia. We are actually a media company with the weekly web portal and radio, which is not common in my country, in my region, but it looks pretty great. Actually, the first story I will tell you something about later, but I want to be brief because I think that as a teacher, I think that it's much more better for you to be interested in something and asking. And you can get everything else by the links, and I don't want to be very to have a very long story. This is the front page of fourth story in Syria. It's about a girl who missed in Croatia when she was 15. And after my own investigation, I found her 8 months later in Italy, in one teeny, not village, but teeny place, actually in suburbs of Milano. And I got her, I brought her home, and she was actually forced to be a prostitute. The other story, and I'm looking for your questions later. The other story is, sorry for that very bad, no, it's okay, but sorry for very bad scan of this one, because I'm traveling all around, and when Maria wanted me to send it, I just found this one. It's actually also the one of the stories from Syria, so stories about human trafficking, but that one actually put the first guy in Croatia on the other side of the bars for 10 years based on my stories. It started exactly like the first one. First one story started when that girl was missing. And more than 20 years I'm also I'm searching for the missing people. And that is why that's starting. I didn't know that she is actually human trafficking victim at the very first beginning. And this one started when one trafficking victim came from Austria. She's one of just a few who escaped from that chain of human trafficking criminals. And she got back to Croatia, and she's originally from Bosnia, but came during the war in 90s to Croatia. And she actually told me her story. And upon that story, but she didn't know the name of the guy. She just explained how he looks, and I was trying to find, I was working months and months on that, and I found another victims, and finally I found out who's the guy, and I published it, and Austrian police with Slovenian police and finally Croatian police put that guy back in Croatia, and she was in jail for 10 years. Unfortunately, that 10 years expired, and he's like. Last few years also, one out of the jail, and maybe doing something like that, something the same, but I'm not sure. Third one is this one you can find. First two stories you can find also, unfortunately, just in local languages in Croatian, or maybe they're mentioned in some manuals or in some international press, but just with few sentences. But this one you can find also online in English. That's 8 stories done in Bosnia and Herzegovina, After the war in 90s, on the place on the northern Bosnia, near the Croatian border, on the place where Muslims, Serbs, and Croatians were lived before the war, and they fought. They were fighting during the war, killing each other, and after that, international community decided to organize some market to get them together. But I myself and one guy from States, unfortunately he's dead now, one editor, as editors we worked with 8 journalists and one photographer from all ex-Yugoslavia countries, and we found out that actually that market became the place of criminal, including the human trafficking of women. And this one is the last one, and we actually collaborated on that with Maria. That human trafficking manual for journalists is actually originally Serbian. Astra NGO from Serbia working on it very, very good. But we did it for the first time 20 years ago. And after that, 15 years ago, we made the second edition. But guys from the journalism found I'm working for, and Maria was doing, and some other guys here who were doing for journalism fund, decided to give money to Astra to publish third edition, but wide, not just local stories from Balkan, but also this one from Ireland, from other part of the world, and this one is in English too. And you can find my first series of story about the missing girl found in Italy is like about 30 pages. I explained everything, all obstacles, what I have done wrong from my perspective, how to protect victim, which line we shouldn't cross as a journalist, everything. Much more better than I can say you today, and it's online. It's not easy. It's easy to find it, and you will have also. I think and that's most of that. And I was working also in some other countries, like I said, in Bangladesh. Actually, the guy from the Daily Star from Bangladesh, where I was 7 years ago establishing a team, investigative reporting team, called me last night or 2 nights ago, saying what they are doing and trying to get some other advice.
Perfect.
And that's what's very important. I'll give you my contacts at the end. And my idea is to not just to say something to you or to any other public, but if you will need anything from me, some address, tips, or if you think that you can help me in some stories or just generally, don't hesitate.
Perfect. And we have everyone's LinkedIn and Twitter and things like that in the tip sheet. So Geesje, you're up.
Thank you. Because human trafficking goes beyond borders, I spoke with Sanne Terlinge back in 2017, and we wanted to start a project.
Put your mic closer to you. No,
closer. Like this? Better. Sanne Terlinge, who is now... We wanted to start a project about human trafficking, and then we started talking about how could you do that, because then you need a lot of traveling money and stuff like that, and you need a lot of time to investigate all the stories. So then we thought of, okay, what about collecting the best journalists there are within Europe and start a project all together. In the beginning we started in 2 or 3 countries. That was in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in the UK with Ismail, and in Italy with Geesje van Haren and Angela. Then we grew into 14 countries right now within the EU. And there are 28 journalists involved. We still want to grow bigger. We want to work in whole of Europe, because human trafficking within Europe is in all those countries, and it's all connected. So we all the pieces of the puzzle lay in every different country, and by doing research in all these different countries and sharing this research within all the journalists, everyone has a better story on the end of the way, and everyone has a better impact with their stories. We started with a number of 10,000 migrant children that are missing within the EU. That's a quote from Brian Donald, the chief of Europol back then. That was in 2015, and we were like, okay, what happened to them? Where are these children? What is going on? So we tried to get the figures again in 2018 until 2020, and then we saw that there were 18,000, more than 80,000 children missing. These are all data from the countries themselves. They are obliged by the children's right to deliver these data, but as you can see, there are many blind spots on the map. Some countries are still not collecting the data or not sharing them with journalists. We now did another investigation into these figures from 2021 until 2023, and there is an alarming number because this number really increased. So we are publishing about that on the 30th of April again. One of the stories, all the stories we publish in several news organizations. This is a story from Ismail. And what we do also to keep people safe and to keep vulnerable people safe, we always work with a great photographer who keeps them anonymous, and that is Kate Stanworth, and she made this photo. And she's also very good in gaining trust. The other thing that we do is create a creative skill. So on photos and pictures that are in real time, we ask graphic journalists to draw the reality in there. So that is something that we do also. And then we make exhibitions out of that. So this is a sea container that tells the stories of these children, and the sea container is traveling around Europe as well.
Perfect, thanks so much. So we're going to have a quick discussion, and then we'll have Q&A. So Ismail, I suppose I'm just going to go to you first. So I was reading some of the tips, which are, the link to it is in the tip sheet, and I was struck by one tip, and that is consider the option of not doing a story. So I was wondering, are there stories that you haven't reported on, and how do you make that decision?
Yeah, I think there are stories that you should report on. I think you need to ask yourself that question. There are maybe boundaries you shouldn't cross. So what I would say to everybody is please look at the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. There is a tip sheet that I did with Sarah Stillman from The New Yorker and Karen Brown from NPR. And it was based on a workshop we did in Jordan, actually, with a journalist covering the Syrian conflict, and specifically working around families and children. But the general point is when we're doing stories about trafficking, modern slavery, migration in general, or any story that concerns violence, is that the person you're talking to might not necessarily be ready or in the right moment or in the right place. Maybe there's a story that they shouldn't tell you or don't want to share that might compromise them, might be an issue for them if they cross into a different country. And there are times where somebody really wants to share, and you feel, given the situation, which is going to be particular to what that situation is for you, that it might not be the right time for them to, to tell the story, which is strange to say, to tell somebody that, right, if they wanted to share with you. But it's really thinking about consent, and there's a whole conversation we can have around consent and what is consent, what is meaningful consent, what is the difference. Again, the DART Center is a great resource for this. But what I would say is this idea of the story as a second act is something that we developed and thought about, because actually there are many situations when you're a journalist, you're on deadline, you don't have much time, or you're a freelancer, you've got a grant, you've got to deliver something, and for whatever reason something doesn't work out and you feel really frustrated. Rather than pushing the person to tell you their story or making choices which compromise them or you or your ethics, the better thing might be just to say, here's my number, here's my email. If you want to talk to me in the future, please reach out. And actually, that means then you develop trust, because remember, trust is not given. I don't think it has to be earned. And as journalists, we have to be very careful working in this space. And the key point is that doing stories about migration, trafficking, etc. We're not interviewing officials. We're not interviewing the police. We're not interviewing politicians. We're interviewing a trafficked child or a teenager or woman who's been trafficked to Sicily for forced sexual slavery, or a child who's been trafficked into the UK. Whatever context it is, we're interviewing not the powerful. So it requires a different set of skills. We need more empathy, we need more sensitivity, and we need to give people more time. And there are different ways in which we can verify the information they give us, but one way is not to hammer them with questions and get them to speak when they're not ready.
Yeah, and I suppose expanding on that, Geesje, you've obviously reported a lot on children, and you obviously need to plan every interaction with that very carefully. So, what type of practical tools do you use to ensure every child you interview is protected?
Yeah, what we do most is it's not only children, but also children who are from another language than we are. So we always take translators with us, so that we can interview them in their own language, and someone whom they trust. And at the beginning of an interview, or we just call it also a discussion with them, we also say that there's a secret code that they can speak up when they don't feel okay in the situation or with the questions that we are asking. They can say the secret code to the people that they trust, or to the translator, and then the interviewing is over, or the question will not be asked anymore. So we don't, like Ismail said, you don't force people into telling their stories, but especially with children, you don't force them into anything. So if they are okay with giving you answers, that's okay, and if it's not, then it's okay also. That the story is not isn't worth it to harm a child. So that is something that we keep in mind. The whole team keeps that in mind within every interview that we do.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing I've kind of seen from younger journalists is the hunt for a story, which often means there's a focus on how to hunt for a victim. So Sasa, you cover this in your trafficking manual for journalists. What have you seen from your years of reporting, and how can this have a detrimental effect?
I'll give you some tips, which they are actually pretty much general, but applicable really much to human trafficking stories also. First of all, be a great listener, don't speak too much. Other one is don't cross the line. I'm thinking about many lines, but one of the most important line is you don't cross as a journalist working on any human involving story, especially human trafficking and where victims are is a line between empathy and sympathy. But sympathy is on the bad side in this story. Empathy is one thing, but sympathy is the other one. About that, crossing that line, you can find many things very specifically in the manual in my story, what I did wrong from my perspective in the first series of stories. Don't do that at home. Don't do that if you're not ready, I'm joking. But the problem is when I'm ready. When I'm talking to the young journalists and to students of journalism, every time I'm saying in the very first beginning, don't do the story if you are not allowed to keep it in your hands. But in 90% you can do that. Don't do the story. I mean, don't publish it. You have to do a story, but don't publish it. You have to be a devil's advocate all the time. And after I did that first series of stories, and that it's mentioned in the manual, I actually asked my very good friend, the great lawyer, and the other guy who is professor of ethics on journalism school to attack on me. Actually, I was attacking myself, and I'm saying, okay, that thing I have done wrong, but they tried to protect me, saying that no, you're doing right good, and that was one of the best journalism training I ever seen. I was involved there, and I was trying because I knew what I did wrong from my perspective, and I was trying to accuse myself, but they were trying to protect me, saying that I actually finally I have done good, but there's no good end. For example, that story about the girl found in Italy. When I published the first article, not saying that she's a human trafficking victim, but everybody in the chain could recognize the girl, and that girl could be killed, like some other girls at the same time. And and finally, I decided that I shouldn't do that story. I got that girl back, but I can't have that story in my own hands. I can't do that. I was working with the specialists like doctors, lawyers on that case, but you can't do that good enough because you don't know what will happen, how will happen, when will happen, and most of the stories shouldn't be actually written under that circumstances.
Perfect, and I think that leads us to just one final question before Q&A, Ismail, because I suppose we're talking about media coverage there in general, and you've worked on the Lost for Europe project and conducted numerous interviews with migrants and refugees, but what do you feel about Europeans' media coverage of such stories?
Well, I think it's pretty negative and it's terrible. So there's a book that I did called Lost in Media, which is a collection of essays about the representation of refugees and migrants, which you can read. So I'll be very quick because I don't have much time. But we had essays by Nisreen Malak, Daniel Trilling, Ece Temelkar, and others. And the media is negative. The lens is dehumanizing, and it's very racialized. And I think it's really important for us to remember when we're reporting on trafficking, migration in general, the context, the political context. You know, we have a situation, we were talking earlier, Maria, in Ireland, where hotels are being burned, housing asylum seekers. We have far-right government in your country here in Italy. For those of you from Italy, you know, we have a situation in the UK where the Rwanda bill has just passed. So we mustn't forget the political context in which we as journalists are telling the story. And it's really troubling to me because I think the focus is missing when actually the migration issue across the world is becoming really very significant, and we have this year of elections where this issue is at the heart of it. So again, not to say much more, but just please, if you're interested in this, look online, Lost in Media. A lot of the pieces from that collection have been republished, including by Daniel Trilling in The Guardian. You can read it as a long read. If you search for it online, you can find it.
Perfect. And we're just going to open the floor to Q&A now, so if anyone has a question, let me know. Okay. Perfect, yep. There's a mic there, yeah, and two there in the back. Perfect.
Thank you. Well done.
Hi, I had a question because you're saying you need to be careful with how you publish a story, but what's another different way to make this public and be sure to make it that everybody knows it, and that it's going to be also a on a political agenda, so that there could be things done to fix this problem.
Yeah, I suppose just from because I wasn't talking about that, but one thing that was a big issue with us is we had found out that there was potential for violence for people who we spoke to from their families in the Philippines, and also the fishers when they went back home. So we had to be really, really careful. So what we did is we gave anonymity to everyone who spoke to us, similar to what Geesje has with the no-face photos and things like that. But Ismail, maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. I think there's lots of ways to do that. It doesn't it doesn't always rest on the interview, and I think the focus of journalism, in my experience, is that it's about the interview. It's not. We can look at data. Geesje just gave some examples from Lost in Europe, where you can utilize cartoons, visuals, you can work with artists. There's lots of ways to tell someone's story without necessarily, if they're not in the right situation, without revealing their story. And I think your second point was more about the political context and how do we make changes. I think that's a really great question. By sharing stories, telling stories, the latest investigation we're working on in Lost in Europe is, again, another data investigation where we, as Geesje explained, and the data is coming out at the end of the month, and again, it's very worrying. And we hope that this latest round of data, which shows the fact that unaccompanied child minors and migrants are missing after arriving in Europe, and no one's looking for them, and no one knows what's happened to them, and states are not keeping records, is really terrible. So we hope that that instigates action. But that's the point of journalism. I hope that people read these things and do something about it.
Perfect. We'll just go down the back. Yep, just down the back there, yeah.
Hi. What do you do if you encounter an unaccompanied minor who's been brought to Europe, so smuggled to Europe with no money paid up front, but then they have to effectively pay their way by working in some industry, be it the fishing or in the olive groves and so on, and so they are being trafficked. But if they were, for example, to go into like state protection of some kind, then they won't be able to work, and then they won't be able to pay back that debt, and they may have family back in their home country who will be threatened if that debt isn't paid back. So what would you do in that situation if you have someone who an unaccompanied minor who's in the middle of a trafficking process, but like there is a debt over his head that has to be paid back some way?
Yeah, that's what we see a lot. Most people that we interview don't call themselves victims because they have a task within Europe, so they're not victims of. But what we can do, especially with children under the age of 18, there are child rights, and we can show how the system fails to protect them. So what does the police do when they see a child like this? And so in that way we can tell stories about their cases without harming their own case, because we know that one specific child, if they don't pay their debts, their family in the country where they from origin will be in big problems, or the children themselves within Europe are also in big trouble. So we work around that. We show how the system fails to protect them. We show how the police checks the box of smuggling instead of trafficking. That's a big difference in police enforcement on how they investigate of that. So those are the things that we do. We hold the institutions into account. That's
Brilliant. There was a question down the very back there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question is, how do you verify that if someone says that he's a minor, whereas he's not a minor, just he claims to be a minor in order to get protection or to avoid the Dublin Agreement? Another question is, myself, as I'm an Eritrean, I have reported a lot on migration from Sudan, Libya, all the way to Europe. When you interview a minor through a translator, how do you verify that the translator is not, because in cases like in Eritrea, they don't trust a translator, believing that he could be an informer for the government or not. So how do you verify this? How do you check it? Thank you.
Yeah, this is normally a question for Sanne, because this is so true, that Sanne made stories about translators from Eritrea that were still working for the regime, and she discovered that within also the shelters where they ask for asylum things, and that was a big wrongdoing in the Netherlands, and after that a couple of people were fired also because they were really working for the regime in Eritrea. So those are the stories that we find also. And your first question was the age. Yeah, we are within the age. Some people that are underage, they aren't allowed to talk to us. and others. So we interview also people until they're 25 years old or something like that, who came into Europe before they were of age. But we also publish stories about also the failure of the system in where minors say that they are minors but they're not, or the other way around. That that's the boat driver story. Maybe you could say something about that in short, but where people were saying, oh, they're adults and they were in prison, in adult prison, instead of that they were juveniles. So.
Yeah, just very briefly, we worked on an investigation between Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands and Greece, looking at the issue of boat captains and the fact that hundreds of cases of migrants, usually underage, held on very flimsy evidence, were being charged with people smuggling, and we found literally dozens and dozens and dozens of cases in Italy especially. And one of the issues is this point of saying, well, are they minors? Actually, what we found is that often they are, and actually that the authorities were trying to deny that they were minors through often very invasive measures where they're checking people's ages, often very flawed process. So I think the question there is, it's also the political context here, which is one of the first things you hear when you're dealing with, children that are between, say, 15 to 18 that are coming through the Mediterranean route into Europe, is that the first question is, well, they're not really children, but that's actually not the case. Nearly all of them are. It's just that we don't believe them, and when they tell us, the authorities don't trust them and don't believe them and investigate them rather than actually looking at their experience of trafficking or modern slavery.
Yeah, and one of the things that we did in terms of evidence, we didn't work with minors, but for every victim that we spoke to, we asked for all of their documentation that they had, so their visas, their passports, like everything they could possibly have, because we needed that evidence to publish the investigation. So and that's important as well. I'm just going to very quickly wrap up in terms of, I'm going to ask each person in one sentence if they can give the most important tip on reporting on human trafficking. So, Sasha, I'm going to start with you. What would be your most important tip? Oh, sorry.
No, I was trying to take a picture.
Oh, no, it's fine. So your most, what would you say would be the most important tip in one sentence if you were reporting on human trafficking?
Most important. I think that I actually told some very important, but I just can repeat. Be devil's advocate all the time.
Yeah.
Don't be sure that something's right just because you think that's right, or that something's right just because even a human trafficking victim told so. I've been in many situations when for example, women trafficked, forced to be prostitutes, I'm beaten or I don't know, raped, and they were talking stories which are in 99% right, okay, but they like focused on one guy. They just met one guy during all that story, and they met another victims from the same story, and they told me like three of them that their guy is the big chief or something like that. But
so I
but it wasn't true because it's just from their perspective. You shouldn't take a word even from a victim as as something which is absolutely right.
Perfect. I think that's a good place to end the conversation. So verification is very important in this. And thank you so much to Sasa, Geesje, Ismail, and myself. and thanks very much for attending the panel.
Thank you. Well done. It was really intense.